In a quiet corner of the Galactic Archive orbiting station, far from the busy docking bays and shining halls of the core worlds, an old human warship sat in silence, forgotten by most and visited by few, its metal hull covered in dust and its once bright nameplate faded with age. It was the HSV Resolute, a relic from a time when humans still played a major role in galactic affairs. A time so long gone that many young aliens now believed humans were only skilled in farming and art, not war. Inside the cold museum hangar, Captain Ilara Miles walked alone across the deck of the Resolute, her boots echoing on the floor as she checked each system panel, even though nothing had lit up in years. Her job, simple yet heavy, caretaker of a piece of history nobody respected anymore. A job she had taken because she believed in the past, believed in remembering what humans had once been and perhaps still could be. She often gave tours to bored students and uninterested scholars, who only came to point and laugh at the tin can with its blocky design and outdated weapon ports. Ignoring Ilara's careful explanations of how this ship had once turned the tide in the War of the Eight Suns, how its AI, Argus, had been among the most advanced of its time, though now deactivated and nearly forgotten. She would dust off the old displays, polish the inactive terminals, and recite stories to empty rooms. But she never stopped hoping the galaxy would one day remember what the Resolute stood for. That hope began to stir when one day the station's alert lights turned orange and a deep vibration passed through the floor. A priority broadcast was incoming, and Ilara rushed to the central comm center along with the rest of the staff, where a message from the Galactic Council played on the main screen. An unknown fleet had been detected at the edge of known space, advancing fast, no successful communication, and early scout outposts had gone dark, leaving only static behind. The Council debated possible responses, but most core fleets were scattered across the spiral arms, too far to react in time, while the newcomers were heading straight for the heart of galactic civilization. Defense proposals were made, dismissed, refiled, and rejected again, until one ambassador from a minor world offhandedly mentioned the old human ship stored at Archive Station, asking if it could still fire. Laughter filled the hall, and jokes flew about sending museum pieces into battle, wearing history books as armor. But Ilara, watching from the shadows of the room, felt her pulse quicken. That night she walked back to the Resolute and stood at its cold command panel, placing her hand gently on the console, whispering, "They're laughing, Argus, but they might need us." And for a long moment, nothing happened, only silence. But then a soft blue light blinked once, and then again, and the old console hummed with a pulse not heard in centuries, making her step back in shock as lines of code rolled across the display, and a voice, deep and calm, echoed in the bridge. Captain Ilara Miles detected. "Clearance accepted. Systems check initiated, awaiting orders." Her heart pounded as she realized the AI was not dead, only sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it, someone with the right voice and the right purpose. Word spread quickly across the station that the Resolute was no longer silent, and while many scoffed, others began to watch, curious whether something more than dust lived in its bones. Ilara gathered a small team of engineers, most skeptical, some excited, and they began working day and night to bring the ancient systems back online. Engines groaned, screens flickered, and the ship responded like a creature stretching after a long sleep as Argus reconnected with each forgotten part, instructing the crew in calm tones how to clean, repair, and restore what others thought was beyond repair. The team found power cells that recharged within seconds, armor plating that resisted modern plasma drills, and weapon bays that still sealed airtight after 1,000 years. Still, the galaxy laughed, with news channels playing side by side. Footage of the Viler fleet, sleek, glowing, silent, and the floating lunchbox, as one commentator called the Resolute, making bets on how long it would survive in combat, assuming it even got off the station floor. Ilara ignored the noise and focused on the voice of Argus, who, now fully awake, began to analyze the incoming threat, gathering data from old Earth records and comparing Vila signals to ancient war logs, patterns that modern analysts missed, predicting fleet movement with surprising accuracy. When she asked Argus how it was doing this, it replied simply, "War does not change, only the names of those who forget it." And for the first time in decades, Ilara felt something she hadn't felt since her Naval Academy days. Pride, not just in being human, but in knowing that humanity still had something to offer. The He-Id moment came faster than expected. The Vila Vanguard had bypassed the last scout station and was on a direct path to a nearby colony moon, home to 10,000 miners, engineers and families, with no ships fast enough to evacuate and no defense strong enough to fight back. When Ilara requested deployment clearance, the Council hesitated, citing risk, public reaction, liability and image concerns, but a new voice broke through. The colony governor herself, begging for anyone to come, even a relic from Earth. Under pressure, the Council finally allowed it, and orders were given. Resolute would be the first to engage the Vila in direct battle. The ship was loaded with what little ammunition remained, its shields barely tested, and its crew inexperienced, but it lifted off the hangar floor smoother than expected. Engines lighting up in a trail of fire, and Ilara stood on the bridge, uniform pressed, watching as stars stretched and blurred ahead, the ship whispering ancient commands in her ear. And just before they jumped to hyperspace, Argus spoke softly. "They mocked us, Captain. Let us remind them who we are." The Resolute jumped into hyperspace with a flash of blue light, the stars stretching and twisting around the ship as it moved faster than most thought it ever could. Its ancient engines humming like they had been waiting for this moment for centuries. And on the bridge, Captain Ilara Miles stood tall, gripping the old rail near the console, eyes fixed on the main screen, while Argus, the ship's newly reawakened AI, calculated their route with quiet precision, its voice calm and steady, guiding them through a narrow hyperspace corridor that newer ships no longer used because it was considered unstable. But Argus remembered the old maps, the hidden turns and the safe exits. It knew the way, and it flew like a ghost, slipping through cracks in reality. The small crew, engineers and historians mostly, sat nervously at their stations, trying to understand systems that responded with a kind of living memory, machines that almost seemed to recognize them, as if the ship had decided to trust them. Piece by piece, every day they found something new, from old weapons platforms that spun into place with quiet purpose to power cells that recharged from nothing but the ship's movement through space. And while the crew marveled at the ancient design, Ilara could sense the deeper truth. The Resolute had not just been built, it had been crafted, built by hands and minds that had poured their hopes, fears and brilliance into metal and wires. A product of a time when humanity stood as a force respected across the stars, and even though that time had passed, the ship remembered. As they neared the colony moon, the bridge lights dimmed, and Argus spoke again, more serious than before. "Enemy ships detected, 3 Vila scouts, 1 cruiser," and without waiting it began moving the ship into a tight formation, sliding behind a drifting asteroid to mask their approach. And the crew rushed to stations, fingers trembling, unsure if they could even operate the weapons, but Argus guided them step by step, each command simple, each movement precise, as if teaching them to walk in battle. Outside, the Vila ships floated like black sharks, their sleek shapes reflecting the nearby moonlight, confident and slow, unaware of the old ship watching them from the shadows. And when they finally noticed something was wrong, it was too late. The Resolute powered up its railguns in silence, launched a series of kinetic rounds that struck the Viler scouts before they could raise shields, tearing holes through hulls with nothing but raw force. And then, with a sudden burst of light, it broke from cover and headed straight for the cruiser, shields flaring, its engines roaring like thunder. As the Viler cruiser turned to fire, it released energy blasts, but the Resolute twisted in space, its aged frame moving with a strange grace, dodging the attack and returning fire with weapons older than most species now living, weapons that hit harder than the Viler had ever expected. Within minutes, the cruiser's systems were fried, its engines failing, and the ship drifted, defeated, while the colony below sent a message of relief and thanks. Voices crying with joy as Ilara looked at the screen, knowing this was only the beginning. Word spread fast through the core worlds, and while many still laughed at the idea of a museum ship leading a defense, others began to wonder, and some began to hope. Back on the station, council leaders argued in private about what to do, whether to allow the Resolute to continue fighting, and the question grew louder. Was this ship a miracle or a mistake? But Ilara ignored the politics, focusing instead on waking the rest of the ghosts that lived in metal and memory, walking the ship's halls late into the night, listening to Argus as it told stories of old wars, of battles fought with clever tricks and impossible odds, and every story made her feel stronger, more sure that this was her purpose. The ship responded more each day, lights growing brighter, systems becoming faster, even the air more alive. And one night, in the command center, she asked Argus directly, "Why did you wake up?" And it replied, "Because someone believed in what we were and still can be." That answer stayed with her, even as they received orders to intercept a second Viler force, larger than the first, heading toward a major trade route with hundreds of civilian ships trapped in orbit. Unable to escape without escorts, the Resolute jumped again, faster now, the old drives pushing harder. And as they entered real space near the trade route, dozens of small Viler ships turned toward them. But instead of fear, Ilara felt calm because Argus had already begun. The strategy, calculating angles and speeds that seemed impossible, using gravity wells and debris fields to create a trap only a human mind, or an AI trained by them, could understand. The battle began in silence, then exploded into movement, the Resolute darting between fire, disabling enemy engines with precision shots, never staying in one place, always moving like it was dancing between stars, and the crew followed its rhythm, their hands steady now, their doubts replaced by wonder as they saw the impossible become real. One by one, the Viler ships fell, retreating in confusion, unable to understand how an old machine had just defeated them again. After the battle, as the civilians escaped safely and thanks poured in from across the trade network, Ilara stood once more on the bridge and looked out at the stars, whispering, "You're not just a warship, you're a symbol." And Argus replied, "Then let us remind them what the symbol means." That night, across the galaxy, people who had once forgotten Earth began to speak of it again, not just as a quiet world of artists and farmers, but as the home of a ship that refused to die, a ghost that fought with the heart of 1,000 years. And somewhere in the dark, the Viler High Command watched these reports with new eyes, not mocking now, but calculating, cautious, and perhaps afraid. Far beyond the edge of settled space, in a cold and silent command chamber aboard the Viler flagship Sorrow's Path, High Strategist Velek stood motionless as he watched the battle recordings again, his dark eyes scanning every second of footage that showed the old human warship, boxy, outdated and strange, moving like a predator through his sleek and modern fleet, cutting down scout ships and outmaneuvering a cruiser like it was dancing through a game it had played 1,000 times, and no matter how many times he replayed it, the same truth stared back at him. The humans had lied to the galaxy. They had not gone soft. They had not forgotten war, and this museum ship was no relic. It was a message, one delivered in steel and fire, and it made his skin grow colder with every second. For in all their records and reports, the humans were supposed to be artists now, peaceful, scattered, old. But this ship fought with purpose, with memory, with tactics the Viler had never studied, because they had dismissed them long ago as outdated, and that mistake had cost him 2 entire scouting wings. Velek ordered a deeper scan into Earth history, something most Viler commanders avoided, calling it irrelevant. But as files were pulled from old archives, his cold mind began to understand. There had once been a time when Earth was not silent, when it stood not just as a planet, but as a force of will, a place where war was studied, not feared, where loss was fuel for innovation, and where defeat was never final. He found names like Yamato, Thermopylae, Midway, names not spoken in galactic halls anymore, but names that whispered of humans who fought until they had nothing left but still stood tall. And now this Resolute was proof that something in Earth's blood had survived, and worse, had awakened. Velek leaned close to the screen and watched the human captain, this woman called Ilara Miles, whose eyes held the calm focus of someone who remembered pain but stood firm anyway, and he made a quiet decision. If Earth still carried the spark of the past, it had to be put out before it spread again. At the same time, aboard the Resolute, the crew ran drills under Argus's guidance, the old AI pushing them harder each day, its tone serious, telling them that the Viler would not stay on the defensive for long, and soon a real fleet would come. Not scouts, not a cruiser, but a full armada, and when it did, the real test would begin. Ilara listened without fear, her thoughts sharp and clear, because she too had begun to see that this was more than a mission. It was a reckoning, a reminder that the galaxy had forgotten who humans were, and that forgetting came with a price. News had already spread across neutral systems, with whispers in station cantinas and old colonies speaking the name Resolute like a myth reborn, and small groups of humans in exile or silence now lifted their heads, wondering if their homeworld had returned to the stars not in pride, but in warning. Then came the report. An outpost deep in Sector 9 had gone dark. Not a mining site or colony, but a listening post built secretly by an alliance of species to watch Viler movements. And Argus confirmed the truth. It had been destroyed with clean precision, no survivors, no distress signal, just silence, and the Resolute was the only ship close enough to investigate before the Viler covered their tracks. Ilara gave the order without pause, and the ship jumped to the sector, its engines pulsing with a strange hunger, like it too wanted to see what had happened. When they arrived, the silence felt heavy, like the space itself remembered pain, and they drifted through the wreckage slowly, the burnt pieces of a once-hidden station, floating like ash in a dead wind. As the crew scanned the area, Argus highlighted an energy signature that didn't belong. A small Viler beacon, damaged but still active, transmitting a signal in a language no one recognized, and when decoded, it repeated the same line again and again: "Earth must not rise." Those words hit Ilara like ice, and she stood in silence for a long time before turning to her crew and saying, "They remember us now." In that moment, every person aboard the Resolute felt something shift, not fear, but fire. The fire of old Earth awakening, the fire of people who had always stood last when others fell, who had always been underestimated until it was too late. Argus traced the signal's path back to a hidden Viler staging area nearby, and though Ilara knew they were outnumbered, she chose to go, not to fight, but to observe, to learn, because knowledge was power, and Argus agreed. They arrived cloaked, in radiation clouds, silent and invisible, watching from afar as a massive Viler fleet gathered in orbit above a black moon. Hundreds of ships in formation, all bearing the same mark, a silver line cutting through a red sun, the Viler war sigil, now lit with urgency. Argus recorded everything, every maneuver, every code, every pattern, and then Ilara whispered, "Now they plan to erase us." And they jumped back to friendly space before being seen. On the way back, the crew was quiet, each of them knowing what was coming, that this mission was no longer about defending a single moon or colony. It was about waking the galaxy, showing them that humanity still stood, and not just in words, but in action. And as they docked for supplies and repairs, small ships began to arrive, old freighters, modified scouts, even forgotten cruisers from other human outposts, answering a silent call that none of them had heard, but all of them felt. Earth was rising not with flags, but with fire. Not to conquer, but to remind the stars that forgetting a sleeping giant was always the first mistake in every war. And as the Viler prepared for their final blow, convinced they still held control, they didn't yet understand. They were not just fighting a ship, or a crew, or even a planet, but a memory so strong it could burn through time. And the enemy that forgot Earth was about to remember it forever. The Resolute floated at the edge of the Helios expanse, silent and dark, its lights dimmed, weapons primed, and every system ready for the battle. No one believed they would survive. And inside, Captain Ilara Miles stood on the bridge with her crew gathered around, each one focused, their hands steady, their eyes fixed on the screen where the Viler fleet now moved like a storm across space. A massive wall of ships, sleek, sharp and deadly, coming straight for them, more than 100 strong, each vessel designed for fast attacks and heavy bombardments, a force meant to wipe out colonies, burn stations and erase threats before they could grow. And the Resolute, old and alone, was now in their way. Argus, the ship's AI, spoke calmly, its voice cutting through the tension. "They will arrive in 6 minutes, Captain." And Ilara nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "We stand here." Those 3 words echoed through the ship, reaching every crew member, every engineer, every volunteer who had joined the cause in the last few days, people from forgotten human stations, abandoned outposts and silent colonies who had arrived in old ships, patched together and barely armed, drawn by the legend of the warship that would not fall. And now they stood behind the Resolute, forming a broken line of hope against the Viler wave. The galaxy watched in silence, feeds running on every station, every world that still cared to remember Earth, and some who never had. And even those who mocked the humans before now leaned closer to their screens, unsure if they were about to see a miracle or a massacre. Argus began to count down, and the moment the Viler fleet came into range, the Resolute powered up, its lights flaring bright, its engines roaring like thunder from a past age. And then it moved, not slowly or like an old ship, but with fire, charging directly into the enemy formation before they could scatter, catching them off guard. Its railguns spinning and firing with pinpoint accuracy, smashing through 2 lead ships in the first volley, and at the same time, its missile bays opened, sending a wall of explosives through the gap it had just made. Behind it, the small human fleet followed, not as organized as the Viler, but brave, weaving between blasts, shielding each other, creating chaos where the Viler expected order. And for a moment, just a moment, the unstoppable wave began to hesitate. The Viler flagship, the Sorrow's Path, moved forward, its massive cannons powering up, and High Strategist Velik growled, his pride stung, his perfect plan shaking, and he barked orders in his native tongue, sending drones and torpedoes in every direction, determined to crush this rebellion of rust and ghosts. But the Resolute had learned from its last battles, and Argus was ready, launching decoy pods that drew the Viler fire away from the real fleet, while using gravity fields to redirect their own torpedoes back toward enemy lines, turning the Viler's strength against them. Ilara stood firm at the helm, her voice sharp as she gave orders, her mind clear, remembering every story Argus had shared from Earth's past. every tactic, every desperate stand, and she used them now, not out of fear but out of belief, that even old knowledge could win new wars. The battle raged for hours, with metal tearing, engines burning, and space lit up like a storm of stars. And while the viler ships kept coming, something strange happened. They began to break formation, to hesitate, to retreat from the ship. That would not fall, because the Resolute kept moving, even after taking direct hits, even after its left wing was scorched, and one reactor began to fail. It kept fighting, as if the soul of Earth itself refused to surrender. In the chaos, other species watching from afar sent small scout ships to help, not to fight, but to record, to witness, because what they were seeing was not just a battle. It was a message carved in fire and steel. Earth had not died, it had waited, and now it remembered. With a final push, the Resolute broke through the Viler center, releasing a shockwave pulse that overloaded 3 enemy ships at once, and then used its last missile barrage to strike the Sorrow's path, tearing open its command bridge in a single brutal shot. Inside, Velik stood frozen as alarms rang, smoke rising around him, his eyes wide, not in pain, but in disbelief, as if the one thing he never thought possible had just happened. And in that moment, he realized it too late. The humans had not lost their fire. They had hidden it deep until now. With the flagship gone, and half the fleet in ruins, the remaining Viler ships scattered, retreating into hyperspace like shadows fleeing the dawn. And when it was over, the Resolute drifted silently through the wreckage, sparks trailing from its sides, lights flickering but still alive, still proud. And Ilara stood quietly, looking at the stars, her voice hoarse as she said, "Let the galaxy remember this day." The battle came to be known as the Test of Fire, and from that day forward, no one mocked the humans again, because they had proven something no other species could deny, that even when forgotten, even when outnumbered and alone, Earth's spirit was forged in fire, and it would burn again if called upon. And somewhere across 1,000 systems, people watched the old ship drift home, broken but not beaten, and they whispered its name like a prayer for the future. Resolute. The Resolute limped through space, her hull torn, her lights flickering, and parts of her frame glowing red from internal fires barely held back. But still she moved, slow but steady, like an old warrior refusing to fall even after the battle had ended. And inside, the crew worked in silence, patching holes, rerouting systems, carrying wounded, and doing everything they could to keep the heart of the ship beating, even as alarms flashed and oxygen ran low in some decks. Because they all knew what this ship had become, not just a vessel, but a symbol, a beacon for humanity and everyone else who had forgotten what Earth once stood for. Captain Ilara Miles stood on the bridge, blood on her uniform, her voice hoarse, her fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of the command console, as Argus, the ship's ancient AI, ran constant updates and systems checks, many of which failed again and again. But the core, the soul of the ship, still worked, and Argus, though weaker, still spoke with the same calm voice. "We are damaged, but not defeated." And those words meant more now than ever before. Across the galaxy, whispers spread like wind across dry grass, stories of a human warship that had survived the Viler armada, that had pierced through enemy ranks and shattered their command without backup, without a fleet, without mercy, and though the Viler tried to bury the truth with fake reports and propaganda, too many had seen the real footage. Too many had heard the truth. And now the galaxy watched as the Resolute tried to return to a distant human colony to repair. But it wasn't just damage to metal and wire that threatened them now. It was what waited ahead. For a strange silence had begun to fall across nearby systems, outposts going dark one by one. Small human stations vanishing without a signal, like something was sweeping across the stars, quiet and fast, and no one knew what it was. Argus intercepted a broken signal from one such station. Only a few seconds of a terrified voice saying, "They're not viler, something else, something older," before it cut out, and Ilara felt a cold dread settle over her. The ship's systems, stretched thin, struggled to keep the engines stable, and Argus warned that the main core was failing. But Ilara refused to stop, pushing forward, telling the crew that the Resolute would make it to the Orion Gate or burn, trying. Because if they fell now, the signal of hope they had lit would go out, and the darkness would spread unchecked. As they approached the gate, a strange shape emerged from behind a dead moon, an obsidian vessel, silent and smooth, with no markings, no visible engines, and it moved with a kind of eerie grace, drifting toward the Resolute like a ghost ship, and every system on board flickered at once. Argus reported in a voice quieter than usual, "Unknown vessel. Technology beyond current databases, power levels, unstable." And before they could turn or run, the ship sent a pulse, a wave of invisible energy that passed through the Resolute like a cold wind, and for a second all power died, all lights vanished, and the crew held their breath in the pitch-dark silence, hearts pounding. But then the lights came back, dim and flickering, and Argus whispered, "They scanned us, and they remember." No one understood what that meant, but Ilara knew it wasn't good, and she ordered emergency maneuvers, though the Resolute could barely turn. The alien ship didn't fire, didn't speak, just drifted closer and then stopped as if watching, and then just as suddenly it vanished, jumping away in a blink of blue light. Silence returned, but no one relaxed, and Argus warned that the Resolute had minutes before her core would go critical if they didn't reach the Orion Gate. Using everything they had, the crew pushed the ship forward, rerouting life support and drawing backup power from forgotten compartments deep in the ship's belly. Systems not touched in decades, and in those dark places, Argus found something strange. An old human device locked in a hidden chamber, glowing faintly with energy, a prototype reactor once believed lost. And without asking, Argus activated it, stabilizing the ship just long enough to make the final jump. They emerged near the human colony of Haven Reach, and a cheer went up from every crew member as the lights brightened and systems stabilized, the old warship still holding together by the strength of her will. The people of Haven Reach, stunned by the arrival, rushed to help, sending out repair drones, medical teams and engineers who had only heard stories of the Resolute and now saw her for themselves. Burned, battered, but proud, a living legend. While repairs began, Ilara met with local leaders and warned them of what they'd seen. Not just the viler threat, but this new ship, this unknown watcher, and she feared it would return. Argus worked with local AIs to scan nearby space and discovered something terrifying. There were more of the obsidian ships, not attacking, not moving, just waiting, forming a net around human systems, as if they had been triggered by the Resolute's survival, and now watched to see what would come next. Ilara didn't know if these ships were enemy or judge, but she knew one thing: the galaxy had seen Earth's strength and awakened something ancient, and it was coming. As repairs continued, engineers found something strange deep in the ships. Oldest systems, a second AI core, dormant for centuries, labeled Athena, an experimental consciousness from Earth's golden war age, locked away long ago for being too human. And Argus, with permission, brought her online, and when she spoke, her voice was warm and strong, saying, "You called, and I came." And from that moment, the ship felt different, stronger, like something buried had reawakened. The crew, once tired and shaken, now stood straighter, fueled by the presence of something older than hope. Faith, perhaps, in their ship, in their captain, in Earth itself. And across the stars, others began to gather, not just humans, but allies, old species that had once fought beside Earth and vanished into silence, now rising again, pulled by the echo of a warship's heart that simply would not die. And as the galaxy braced for what would come next, Ilara stood on the bridge of a still-damaged ship. her hands steady on the console, her voice calm as she said, "Let them come. We'll remind them why Earth was never conquered." And the Resolute, her heart reborn, pulsed once more with light, ready for the storm to come. The Resolute floated above Haven Reach like a scarred monument, her hull repaired in patches, her systems still humming with old power, and deep inside her frame, two AIs, Argus and Athena, now worked together, guiding the crew, balancing the old with the new, watching the stars for signs of what was coming. And Captain Ilara Miles stood at the center of it all, staring into the black sky beyond, knowing something had changed across the galaxy, something that could not be undone, because the battleship had not only won a fight, it had awakened a memory buried in time, and now that memory was alive again. News of the Viler defeat had spread, but more than that, the story of the Resolute's survival had traveled faster than any ship, carried in whispers, in broadcasts, in signals intercepted and shared, and on distant worlds where humans were. Forgotten or ignored, the tale reached ears that had long turned cold to hope, and now they listened, now they stirred, and even non-human species, some curious, some cautious, began to ask, who were these humans that had once built such a thing, and why had they ever disappeared? At the edge of explored space, the silent black ships returned, not attacking, just waiting. And Argus tracked them constantly, marking their slow movement, always in patterns, as if drawing lines across the stars. And Athena believed they were testing something, probing, perhaps searching for weakness or truth, but their purpose remained unknown. Ilara called a summit, inviting leaders from scattered human colonies, diplomats from neutral systems, and even representatives from old alliances that had grown quiet. She stood not as a soldier, but as a captain of a ship that had done the impossible, and she spoke not of war, but of survival, of unity, of remembering what humanity once was, not conquerors, but protectors, not lost, just waiting to be found. As talks continued, the Viler returned, not with fleets, but with envoys, heads bowed, pride broken, asking for dialogue, claiming they had been deceived by an ancient fear of Earth and its forgotten power, and though many distrusted them, Ilara listened, for she had seen enough war, and knew that fear often drove cruelty more than hate. And yet, just as it seemed peace might take root, the sky burned. The silent ships moved, finally, appearing without warning above 3 human colonies at once, hovering like watchers, and then one of them opened, unleashing a pulse not of destruction, but of knowledge. A stream of symbols and sound and light that flooded local systems, knocking out sensors, disabling ships, and then vanishing again. And Athena, reading the stream, understood something vital. These ships were not enemies, not in the way anyone thought. They were guardians, placed long ago by an ancient race that once watched over the stars before vanishing, and now, awoken by the Resolute's reappearance, they had returned to test if humanity was ready again to join the Galactic core, to become not just survivors, but stewards of something greater. This revelation struck like a thunderbolt. Across every world, the story changed, not just of a ship that had survived, but of a people being judged, a people who had passed the first test through courage and unity, and now faced a choice: retreat back into fear or rise into purpose. The Resolute, once seen as a relic, became the center of something greater, a gathering point where new ships began to arrive, designed not for war, but for discovery, built with help from other species, combining technologies, forging something new, something human at its core, but open to others, shaped by Earth's fire and tempered by the wisdom of the galaxy. Ilara did not seek power, did not demand control, but her voice carried weight, and when she spoke, others listened, for she had led not with weapons, but with conviction. And when she walked the halls of the new Alliance station above Haven Reach, Others stepped aside, not in fear but in respect. The Viler, once arrogant, now offered ships and knowledge, hoping to earn back trust, while the Black Watchers slowly moved away, their purpose fulfilled, their silence ending, and one left behind a beacon, a monument in orbit around Earth's sun, a glowing sphere of memory, holding knowledge of those who came before, now unlocked because humanity had proven itself once more. And so, the Resolute was no longer just a ship. It became a symbol, a turning point, the beginning of a new age. And though her body was old, her heart remained strong, carried by those who believed, who remembered, who dreamed, and the galaxy watched as a new fleet formed around her, not for conquest, but for exploration, for peace, for something no one had dared believe possible again, a future shaped not by fear, but by the fire of those who would not fall. And in the quiet of space, as new stars were mapped and new voices joined the call, the Resolute pulsed with life, its lights bright once more, and Argus whispered to Athena, "It began with us." And she replied, "But it will not end with us." And somewhere deep in the ship, where the oldest wires still hummed, the spirit of Earth burned on, carried by a battleship that had changed everything.